This is Irish Books, for intelligent discussions of contemporary Irish writing. A reclusive restorer of sculptures is forced to engage with his emotions in Adrian Duncan's exploration of art, faith, and love. Irish Books is hosted by Christopher Murray.
We are sitting in University College Dublin on a misty morning. Lucy Collins is here to discuss Adrian Duncan's novel, The Gorgeous Inertia of the Earth. Lucy, can you give me an idea, please, what goes on in this book?
The book centres on a character called John Malloy, who is a restorative sculptor. And John is born and raised in Ireland, but he lives in Europe. He moves around quite a lot, studies in the Netherlands, works in the US, before settling, it seems, in Italy, where he has met and fallen in love with an Italian sociologist called Bernadette. And the two share this passion for stone, which is a unique passion for the two of them. And it's something that binds them together, I think, in the early part of the book. The book is in two parts. So the first part engages with around the time he meets Bernadette and begins to become intimate with her. And then the second part of the book is set when John is in his mid-50s and when they have this settled life together as a couple in Bologna. And John has just received news of the terminal illness of a friend of his, and it precipitates a crisis, a kind of crisis of... almost a crisis of faith, as we might think about it. And so the second part of the book is taken up with that investigation.
And John is, to me, a strange character. For one thing, in his professional life as a restorer of sculptures, of which he also makes miniature replicas, he has a twofold relationship to problematic aspects of his past. One of which is that his father worked at the quarry and was seriously injured on two occasions. One in using dynamite at the quarry to extract the stone, and on another occasion when he was brutally beaten by members of the local community for defending his wife, John's mother, who had reported seeing a statue of the Virgin Mary moving. So John is deeply invested in both stone itself and sculptures and statues. Although he's a very repressed character, isn't he? It's hard to get under his skin reading that novel.
While traversing the narrow and busy streets converging on the bowl-shaped stadium in the distance, Bernadette turns to me and asks, as we drift for a moment closer to each other, if it was because of my leg injury that I went on to study stone restoration. I hesitate as the crowds around us gather, and I can feel her looking at me. And because this connection between broken bone and stone had not occurred to me before, I just shake my head and say, "Don't think so, Bernadette."
He's such a tentative figure, I think, at the beginning, in that first part particularly. There's always this sense that he is withholding things, or he's kind of unable to articulate or unable to communicate with other people. So that sense of him as living in his head, as living in a world of endless attention to detail, endless observation of the material world around him.
Yes, it's an intensely descriptive book, isn't it?
Intensely so. I mean, there's almost nothing but description. It's extraordinary, really. It reminded me in some weird way of Thomas Mann's Death in Venice. And I couldn't work out at first what the connection I was making there. And I think it's because we're seeing everything through the gaze of John. You know, where the whole world that we're brought into in the novel is through his gaze. And there's very little easy connection, communications, very little drama or unfolding events. You know, everything is in that kind of reflection of the relationship of the self to this materiality.
So it's very heavily, I would say, ekphrastic. It's writing that describes visual art a lot of the time. Do you feel then, is there a novel in this? There is a love story. There is the crisis of John's friend Anna being terminally ill, and the way that this pulls him back to the difficulties of his childhood. But do you feel that, does this all work as a novel?
I think that, I mean, this is a novel of ideas. This is not a novel of sort of plot and character, really. So I think you have to stay with the ideas and stay with this quite, I hesitate to use the word tormented, because he doesn't appear as a tormented character, but there is a sense of struggle, I suppose, or of effortful building of meaning in the book, yes. I think. And so that sense that John is always is always reaching for something that's beyond himself, I think is there from the start. But one of the things I really like about the book is that it actually warns us off metaphor. You know, it warns us off that idea of, oh, here's a scene that there's an allegory for something else, or, you know, that explains his issues or whatever. We're persistently warned off that. There's specific moments in the narrative where, say, Bernadette is likening or suggesting that his injury, the injury to his leg he suffered as a young man, as a teenager, I think, was kind of responsible for his turn towards this kind of intellectual engagement with Stone, and he refutes that immediately. And there's a few other instances of that where we're led away from that sense that there's any kind of simplistic alignment between plot episodes, in as far as they exist, and the larger ideas of the novel. I think it's all about the disconnection of those things, and that's what's most powerful, I think, about it.
Are there particular passages then that you have in mind of that kind of warning off, if you want to?
There's an interesting sense in which a passage that perhaps we would expect to carry a metaphorical weight, if you like, since there's a lot about weight and lightness, I think, in the novel, doesn't quite add up to that. You know, it stops short, I guess, of that conclusion. We're not allowed to think of it metaphorically. Mm. As I chased across the field, I could see the fallen balloon, which looked like a giant stricken animal being resuscitated. The wicker basket had toppled onto its side, with a pointed flame sending hot air back into this exhausted form. I walked around it and found two men hunkered at the other end, repairing a strip of rubber. They told me they were going to lift off again. I stalked around the flailing thing once more until, on one flank, with no one there to see me, I stepped forward and touched it. I stepped back to see how or if my gesture had altered anything. Then I pushed again, harder this time, on the flank of this creature, until a dried cowpat was revealed in the bent grass below. The ease with which I put this huge object out of shape, and the feeling on the palm of my hand at that time, touching this angelic thing, is one I can still feel if I close my eyes and think back to the hollow roar of a gas flame, the smell of silage, dung, and the excited murmurs of those ghostly figures gathering round. By the time I returned to the wicker basket, the balloon was beginning to lift from the ground like a person's head, still heavy with sleep, rising from their pillow at dawn. Two men and a woman struggled to hold the wicker basket at an angle, as the aviators, or continental ballooning enthusiasts, as my mother called them, arranged themselves within to direct the blue jets of hot air into the anus of the bloating beast. I remember my father leaning on his walking stick, his older and yet far healthier brother beside him, both of them looking up at this tear-like balloon taking shape above the broad green field. My mother joined them. She took my father's hand in hers and squeezed, and he looked to her and smiled. Then they both squinted up at the balloon, now stretching skyward. I looked down at the base of the wicker basket to see that instant when it lifted free, and when it did, I saw many blades of longer grass caught in the folds and weft of the wicker, tug for a moment until they were overwhelmed.
Marvellous. Anus of the bloating beast indeed. And you're right, it's striking that for most of the novel, Duncan avoids maybe easy metaphor or simile, and he doesn't lean into the obvious associations we might make between, say, the feeling that we as people feel incomplete and John's work in restoring sculptures, which are broken and fragmentary in some way. And we're left to piece those things together ourselves.
I think the other interesting thing about that is the touch, the element of touch, because that idea that he goes to touch this strange object, and that he's aware of a self-censoring in that, like he's looking around, is he being observed? Is he allowed? There's this sort of sense of permission or not. And of course, later when he's in the church, much later at the very end of the novel, this idea of touching things that he's prohibited to touch.
Yes, he touches the statue of Mary. The climactic scene, I think, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. So there's a lovely balance there, I think. And it's those details, I think, which lead us away from simple or reductive metaphor, because there is actually a reality, a tangible quality, I think, to that scene and his response to it, which is picked up, then later, obviously, in the narrative.
That sense of surveillance and scrutiny and guilt sounds very Catholic, doesn't it? And there is a Catholic presence through the novel, a Catholic presence which is maybe communicated to us by use of negative space, because it is John constantly refuting Catholicism and feeling this need to pray when he's told that Anna is terminally ill, but finding himself unable to pray. And his partner Bernadette says at one point that he pities him, this inability to pray for his friend.
But it's interesting that at that point in the narrative, he links prayer, the idea of prayer, to, he says it only ever does bad things or whatever, like that he sees it as having negative outcomes.
He does say that. In fact, when Bernadette says to him, "So you never pray," John replies, "It has only done damage as far as I can see."
And there's an image as well of his mother in her post-visionary state, if you like, as kind of as exhibiting exertion, an almost physical exertion as a result of this vision. So there's a strange sense in which, and then he links this obviously to her the deterioration of her mental state. So he sees her visionary capacity as destabilizing her mentally in some way. So he sort of links those two together, and they obviously have been linked to it. The fact that the outcome of her vision is that she is placed for a time in a mental institution. So that sense in which the characters must stay within bounds, you're not allowed to move outside the boundaries of the rational in some way. But there is another moment earlier in the narrative where he associates that visionary dimension in his mother with a kind of radiance, with this sort of transcendent element. Yes. So there are hints of that more positive dimension of the visionary or of the prayerful, that it's almost as though he then blocks out or marginalizes the more positive dimension in favor of the more labored.
I think you're right. And you signal a deeper meaning behind those words I just read about prayer only being harmful. I think that John means that even when there is a genuine moment of transcendence, that it proves harmful, and that this refers back to his mother. And perhaps we could talk about that history of his mother, because it's such a fascinating aspect of the novel. We're told that this incident of John's mother witnessing a Marian apparition has occurred some years before the moving statues incident of 1985, which began when two witnesses reported a statue of the Virgin Mary moving in Ballinspittle in County Cork. And thereafter, that summer, some 30 similar apparitions were reported around the country. And what we are told in this novel is that John's mother has seen an apparition of the Virgin Mary statue moving some years prior to this, and it was not accepted by the community. And I find that fascinating, that this is not correct Catholicism, which was historically the case, in that the Second Vatican Council in the 60s tried to quell devotion to the Virgin Mary as not being authentic Catholic practice, as being sort of idolatrous. But I'd never heard of this sort of violent response to personal faith before.
And it is interesting that, as you mentioned earlier, the father is beaten up on account of his defence of his wife. So that idea that there is a popular feeling against that visionary dimension.
Against the visionary or against deviation, is it a very conformist?
I think it's it's that idea that the visionary is breaking these bounds, is breaking this sort of the containment and the control of the Catholic Church. And also, of course, it's drawing power towards the woman. I mean, because she's the vehicle, if you like, for that visionary moment. And so it's obviously very important that the priests close that down, pack her away to an institution, brand her mentally ill.
Because the priest is not needed as the intercessor if the Virgin Mary is providing the direct line, so to speak.
But there's also an uneasy dimension, I think, for me in the book about the way when he describes this or tells Bernadette about this, he says, I think that she's the only person he's spoken to, about this event. And there is a sense in which he's also excluding it he is editing it out. He's censoring that experience to a certain degree. He is editing from his fiction, as it were, from his thought process. And
he mentions it, I think, as he's such a repressed character and he is wondering what to do with romantic love. And he produces this memory, an important memory of his childhood hardships, sort of as a token of what one needs to supply in a romantic relationship, that he needs to give something of himself to Bernadette. And he comes up with this remarkable series of incidents, which of course resulted in his mother's institutionalization and decline.
And in fact, there is a sense throughout, I think, that John thinks very carefully about and almost strategically about disclosures, There's nothing impulsive about the way he describes experiences or feelings or things that are happening to him, if you like. I'm thinking particularly of that moment where after he's received the letter relating to Anna, where he says he doesn't want to tell Bernadette when they're in the restaurant, because he would be telling her in Italian and he doesn't want to communicate this sort of important news he says, in a language in which he feels ungainly.
That's right. So he wants to plan his emotional processing of this terrible news. And the half of the novel that is set over a single day in Bologna is a sort of Goldilocks storyline in which John tries to find the right spiritual setting in which he can experience the catharsis over Anna's death. And Anna's a very important character to John because she is his opposite in some ways, that she is earthy, very much in touch with her sexuality. And she encourages him to go after Bernadette in the earlier part of the novel.
And you could even see her as sort of creating the space for him in which he can pursue Bernadette, and he can achieve that relationship, I think.
That's right.
So she is very much a facilitating character, I think, even though she doesn't, in terms of actual presence in the book, it's not a large presence. And that's another interesting thing, I think, that actually we would expect such a crisis to be precipitated by someone who he's very close to or has a long, an evident relationship with. But we're not getting much of that in the book.
Well, it's because he's not close to anyone.
Yeah.
On one hand, John is a frustrating character because he gives us so little of his interiority or of his emotional self. On the other hand, I see that as a challenge that the novel takes on to bring us into this character who constantly wants to push us away.
But I'm interested that you use that phrase, pushing us away, because it's like everything is configured spatially in terms of relation. And I was thinking about, the sculpture of Achim and Bettina.
Yes.
And that idea of this two figures, human figures that are proximate, are touching, and the sort of damage that if you break that statue, if you damage it, you're damaging that relationship, if you like, between two bodies, And even when you think about the way he looks at Bernadette in bed, when he's in bed with her, that sense in which he's sort of positioning her body in relation to him, in this very stylized kind of way,
So Bernadette and John have met when they are assigned to work together on the statue of Achim and Bettina, isn't it? In Eastern Europe somewhere. And I remember John is taken aback when he learns that the two figures were actually made separately and that he hadn't seen how they're pushed together. And this unsettles him somehow, that they weren't a unity.
Because when you actually look at images of them, it's a strangely kind of intimate pose of the bodies, very unusual. So it's interesting that he's reflecting on that,
One of John's hobbies then is that he records the properties of different rocks. And what struck me is how unnecessary this is, in a sense that no doubt countless taxonomies of rocks exist already, but John needs to do it from scratch, like he is a Victorian documenting the properties of different rocks for the first time. And he makes a great list of different rocks and texture and color and under what conditions they will fragment and in what shapes they will break apart.
Yeah, I think that last point, though, is a really interesting one, that idea of in what way, if they're put under pressure, if you like, in what way do they break?
Yeah,
and that has got to be
shards or dust or powder.
Yeah, and that's got to be relevant to his sense of the pressure being placed on the human in this search for meaning, But there's also, I suppose, that sense in which, and I think it goes along with the idea, this close observation, this attention to detail that's there throughout the book, is that it's almost like he needs to look, to attend, to record those details, to make them his own, to understand them. It's not enough that someone else has that information that you're describing about the rocks. He's got to make it. It's like and it's like the making of replicas as well. The miniature replicas. He's got to make the thing himself, to sort of absorb it into himself.
I was surprised that he persisted with that attempt to pray, because I kept wondering whether he would recognize art and making as a substitute for, or as a kind of prayer instead, but that he kept returning to the idea of the spoken prayer.
And a state of mind, I suppose, that isn't related to the labour, I suppose, that he undergoes when he's engaging with stone and with art. And he thinks of it in terms of making in that quite physical way. But I thought, to me, that was one of the really satisfying things about the book, was that it didn't sort of say, oh, well, the revelation is that art is the redemptive thing. It didn't go there. It's such an easy route to take, but it didn't take it.
So again, the book is steering us away from our expectations or from the great conventions and cliches. And it does that at the level of the sentence by shying away from the obvious turns of phrase and the metaphors, and also with the development of John and his need for catharsis, as we would say. It doesn't end up quite where we expect it to.
And I think that's true of the shape of the book, which is quite destabilizing. I mean, you could see the book, of course, as drawing attention to its materiality on the page.
How so?
Which is a sculptural thing. And it's because, okay, there's two parts, which is fine. And that's nicely balanced. And
it's quite short for one thing.
Yeah, it is quite a short book. But the chapters within those two parts, some of them start on the left-hand side of the page. Some of them start on the right-hand side, so there isn't a sort of an ordered episodic, it moves away from that sense of episode and connection. And then more profoundly, there's a lot of white space.
There is. Book. That's very artistic.
There are some parts that are, 3 sentences long, not even 1 sentence.
I'm looking at a subchapter here. I step out of the main entrance and into the sun. And that is its own page, and there's nothing else on that page. And there's a whole load of white space or negative space around it, which is very artistic.
Yeah, I mean, it does have that poetic, dimension of thinking about the page as a unit on which you're placing words. And there are those natural pauses of the sense that he might be observing something, and then he switches his gaze or concentrates on something else or has a memory or, So I think there are natural ways in which there are gaps and spaces opening up, in his interior. The other thing I was thinking of in relation to the space was because, of course, Adrian Duncan's earlier books also have that. They're interested in construction, in building, in architectural space. And there that sense of a structure that works around an empty space.
Yes.
And of course, churches, similarly, are all about that empty space. that's articulated by the shape of the architecture, So I think he's playing with that as well, very profoundly, very effectively, I think, as well.
You mentioned Thomas Mann. Was there anything else the book reminded you of?
No, well, I think, it seems more in a tradition of the European novel. I know that's a meaningless phrase almost, but there was something that wasn't Irish about the novel, in the sense, and that's not just to do with the fact that obviously he has left Ireland, he is moving through these different spaces that are very, especially in the second part, very, very distinctively and evocatively Italian, I think. But it's not just that. It's not just the sense that Ireland is abandoned to memory almost. There's something in the philosophical pursuit of the narrative, I think. And the fact it doesn't feel it needs to have lots of characters. It doesn't feel it needs to be a people-centered novel, I think, which seems to me to move it out of that kind of tradition of the Irish novel, if we can say, being more about subjectivities, encountering one another, more about communities, people, those interactions, and I think we're quite deliberately detached from those ties, if you like, and that's part of his how John is situating himself in the world, I think, and it's part of his struggle as well. It's part of what he's up against when he's trying to find meaning,
It's a very transnational kind of Irishness, and there's a surprising, to me anyway, lack of an obvious affinity between John's Irish background and Bernadette's Italian present. That, I suppose it's another way in which the novel avoids the obvious associations, that they don't seem to bond over Catholicism.
Yes, yeah. And in fact, there's an interesting kind of disjunction between that sense that when in the scene where John is telling Bernadette about the mother's visions, and Bernadette speaks rather sort of dismissively about the moving statues, and the sort of like the facile nature, I suppose, of that encounter. And he, in a sense, defends them. He states that he believes in the mother's vision. So in a way, he's articulating, some of that, I suppose, is a personal affinity to the mother and an emotional connection, but he's also asserting a belief in that. But yet, when he's struggling to pray and he looks for Bernadette, he asks Bernadette about her prayer, and that's flagged up beforehand because he reflects on how she might pray. He wonders about it, if you like, before he asks her. But then, it's clear that she has a private spiritual articulation, I suppose, that he doesn't have access to.
He comes not to approve entirely of it. At one point, he visits Bernadette's church and finds it perhaps ostentatious, and he thinks privately that there must be something amiss with her spirituality if this is its venue.
Yes, yeah, exactly. He judges her in that sense. Yeah.
He does, and continues to find his own mode of religious experience, his own venue for it.
Yeah. But it's also interesting that in the several episodes where he enters the church, that he's repelled sort of from grace, as it were, for very banal reasons, So, for example, there's the instance where he goes in and there's the veneration of the Blessed Sacrament, and he's told he can't approach the altar.
Yes.
So he's sort of repelled there. So there's that sense in which he's been excluded from that space, and then of course when he's ejected by the priest,
he's ejected forcibly.
Yeah.
So there's there's an authoritarian quality to institutional religion evident in the novel.
And that is, I suppose, a connection back to the Irish sense of the priest as policing the boundaries of the visionary,
That's right. And the lived experience of faith versus institutional life, and these debates that were had at the time of the moving statues incidents, I suppose, and the hostility that the Catholic Church expressed towards private or idiosyncratic expressions of faith.
And particularly, I suppose, that emotional, that sense of them as uncontrollable and emotive sort of responses.
And that's what the threat was. We've ended up back on Catholicism, even though we've said it's such an un-Irish novel in some ways.
But it's not an Irish kind of Catholicism, though, in a way. I think there's the aesthetic emphasis that, when he's thinking about sculptural forms and he's thinking about the space of the church and so on, the physical space, like, I think that is an aestheticized version of the Catholic that's thinking about it in terms of traditions, different traditions, rather than a faith-based engagement with it, which is interesting.
I wish I thought more strongly about the trip to the football match, which is one of those few counterpoints to religious buildings as sites of worship. It's one of those obvious associations which perhaps we're invited to make and which the novel doesn't pursue, is that when John and Bernadette attend a football match and they notice the fanatics, the ultras, and it's a moment that threatens to overwhelm them, and they risk losing each other in the crowd of these fanatics.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, I suppose, as you say, it obviously speaks to that idea of strong collective feeling, which, obviously we associate with religious mania too. So there is, yes, a delicate counterpoint there. But again, as you say, because it's not taken up or it's not pursued or even reflected on at length by John, I think it's just left to as this episode.
Kind of tantalizing offer for us as readers.
Yeah. And I suppose there is that cultural thing. It very powerfully evokes Italian sort of community, street scenes, interactions. I think that it's very vividly
It's meticulous.
rendered.
It's really intensely descriptive of. I feel like I know Bologna and I haven't been there.
I have been there, and it's like, oh yes, I remember they do show.
Did it strike you as true to life?
Yes,
or as
yes,
imaginative?
very. But the other thing that really struck me as well is that attention to the passerby, there's a lot of people working in this book. There's a lot of, people sort of trundling wheelbarrows and carrying things and going about their daily labour.
And there's a momentary nod in passing, and then you'll never see that person again. Yeah. So there are lots of cameos and few central characters who are rounded out.
Yeah. But again, it's like that because so much of the novel is concerned with stasis and movement, and that idea of, particularly when John is like sitting in a cafe outside, say at a cafe table and observing the movements around him. So it's this strange sense of the dynamic world moving around the still center that is John, and that does, I suppose, draw attention to that, to his stillness as a narrator, the way he uses language and his incapacity to act or his struggle to...
That's right, his outsiderdom, despite his decade in Bologna, that he's still not fully integrated. He's become, instead of a restorer of sculptures, someone who designs and supplies playgrounds in Italy. And this seems like a remarkable abandonment of an aesthetic vocation, doesn't it?
And he does reflect on that, about that sense that the kind of bond that Bernadette and he had around the passion for sculpture is being dispersed, if you like, in their everyday life, through their work and their other activities. But there's a strange sense in which it's not, he's internalized that interest and it's still there. Even though he's not working, it's not his job anymore. And there isn't, you don't get a sense of this as a destructive, it's a surprising thing, perhaps a disappointing thing, but it doesn't seem to be registered by John as something kind of traumatic or frustrating or something he's going to walk away from, or that he, a creativity that he needs to reclaim, or you don't really get that sense, do you?
He doesn't say that he's unfulfilled, but of course he probably wouldn't tell us. But like you, I was struck by that moment in which John notices that he and Bernadette were brought together by art, by this common interest in aspects of sculpture, and that interest in art has faded from their relationship, but that the relationship survives. And one wonders what the inference should be, whether art has simply fulfilled a function. Is art simply transactional? like everything else?
I don't believe so, though, in the book, in the sense that his sensibility returns. That when he's in those churches at the end, his sensibility still dwells on the space, the materials, the tactility of those spaces as well. So he's still very immersed in the way he was as a younger man, but it's just that he's not practicing it. It's not part of his everyday life.
No, he's not committed to it.
Yeah. Which is strange, because if you think about, obviously we've made the link, or implicitly, with the connection to the father working in the quarry, that he inherits this love of stone and this fascination in that way. So you would think of it, if it happened early in his life, you would think of it as an enduring part of his character, if you like, and not something that could be easily left aside. So it's a strange, disconcerting, I suppose, element of the book. That we're not invited to think of him necessarily as disappointed or cut off from a kind of artistic
we don't look
energy,
on, Perhaps we should look on supplying playgrounds the same way we might on corporate art or something like that, a kind of selling out, but that's not laboured either. The book doesn't really call attention to that.
No. And we get no sort of insight into it because we're just looking at one day, effectively, of his later life. So
that's right.
And that is a day out of his work.
Yes.
When he's on holidays, as it were, which is really interesting, because in the first part of the book, it's all work. He's working all the time, and he's working in the evening, and he's kind of falling asleep over his work, and his work is the point of connection with Bernadette.
And he's learning trades.
Anna, all of those things.
Learning the trades in his spare time in America. He doesn't make anything of his time in America other than to acquire more skills. Yeah. And not only is he on holiday on this day in Bologna from work, but that it is an abnormal day of reflection for John, and that we understand that it is deeply atypical of the character, and that he will resign this and probably just go back to work tomorrow and meet Bernadette and Philomena at the restaurant and have their normal kind of conversation.
Yeah, because it almost seems when you see that day of reflection, if you like, it really shows the contrast with the first part of the book, which is so full of movement and activity, and as you say, learning skills and labour and effort, and so and the second part then is all walking, reflection, absorption,
Would it be another point that is too obvious to make, that the novel might be commenting on the fragmented nature of modern life, in the sense that the character must allocate the time in which he mourns, and that this is entirely separate from his day-to-day life?
Yes, I mean, I think that's definitely there. And that sense in which I think part of the feeling of almost desperation that he must pray for Anna, that and this strange sort of injunction that comes in the letter from Patricia, that you must pray for her speedy death because she's suffering, and it's quite a strange, quite an eerie request as well,
It's a remarkable thing in which Anna's friend warns John off what would be a typical response to wish that the person would survive, and says you must will Anna to die, and that's striking, isn't it?
And I wondered about that in terms of the whole problem that John has with attachment, that sense that even though he, as you pointed out earlier, he doesn't have many connections, he doesn't have many friends or close relationships, and yet he also doesn't let go of them either. There's this sense in which the few he has, he sort of never moves on from or detaches from, So even, the whole unfolding of the relationship with Bernadette is tentative, and she sort of disappears, and then he's wondering, will she contact him, or will he go, and there's all that sort of thing where the relationship hasn't closed, it hasn't ended, but it's not quite active either. And you get that sense even with the way he remembers his parents as well.
Yes.
You get this strange sense that they're sort of present as well as past, and so that whole difficulty, I think what crystallizes the crisis around Anna is that it's a clear request to detach from, to say she must go, this must end, and he's not able to do that really.
So despite the character's inclinations, we do get quite a nuanced sense of character reading this novel. Although we don't get much of Bernadette, really is another sort of opaque figure in the book.
Yeah, you don't quite get a sense. I mean, clearly the bond, and particularly at the end of the novel, it really asserts that human bond, that love for the human as the sustaining thing rather than the transcendent dimension of prayer. But at the same time, you don't get a great sense of the particularity of Bernadette or why she excites this feeling in him or this connection. You know, you don't quite get that. She's quite an elusive character. And even when she's in those early days when he's connecting with her, she sort of comes and goes, you know, she sort of moves into his space to get him out of bed, to get him to go out to work or go on a project or whatever, you know, and then she recedes again. And there's even that scene, and I think they're in a bar or something where he thinks she's looking for someone else, or she's looking away, you know. So there's often that sense where her gaze is somehow directed.
It's very tentative.
Yeah.
And it's a very ambiguous relationship to the outsider. And it doesn't appear to be one of passion, to put it one way. It's not a racy love story. And Bernadette has a daughter and has this past of her own. She has had a family and is moving on with John.
I mean, there is almost that moment when you turn to part 2 where you go, oh, they're still together.
Yeah.
You know, because you might almost think, something radical would have changed. He'd be in a different place. He'd be with a different person, or his life, you know, the life of part 2 would be radically different from the life of part 1. But there's this disconcerting, I mean, in a positive way, disconcerting sense in which there's a great deal of continuity between part 1 and part 2, even though the sense of the stage of life, the kind of groundedness of part 2, that they are in this space, it is a domestic space. They have this endurance in their relationship, you know, so that there's a groundedness there that isn't there, obviously, in part 1. But there is still a lot of continuity, I think, in terms of, we almost don't feel he's any closer to Bernadette.
We don't.
By part 2 than he was in part 1.
And the continuity between parts 1 and 2 is possibly not on the grounds that we expect, again, because it is Anna who is the occasion of crisis in part 2, rather than anything to do with Bernadette, or rather than John deciding he hates Italy or playgrounds or whatever it is.
Yes, so that the precipitation of the crisis is also kind of coming from left field a little, you know, it's sort of coming from outside.
The book ends up then with John symbolically reconnecting as finally he locates a charger for his phone, and he returns to the normal world and plugs his phone in and leaves it buzzing as the messages come in, and knows that one of those will be notifying him of Anna's death.
But interestingly, the bulk of the messages are Philomena and Bernadette looking for him the previous day. You know,
where have you been?
Yeah,
passed out in a church.
Yeah, and also they're all past. You know, they're all in some ways. While the message we imagine will come in about Anna's death is the poignant, important message, but it's lost among all these other messages that are no longer relevant.
Well, they will have been urgent at the time.
Yeah, at the time, but they're gone now. Yeah.
Where are you?
Yeah, you know. So again, a strange sense of the past. I mean, if we think about the way the past, even though there aren't many episodes of memory, but they are there and they're throughout, and they may be quite brief. You know, memories of the childhood house, for example, that recur. And then he later tells us that it's been demolished, you know, so the sense that it's erased in every sense. It's not just that he's moved away from it, but it's actually erased from the earth, as it were. So there is that sense of what is erased and yet what continues in the mind, you know, which is quite powerful, I think. I was interested in the comment that Bernadette makes about, I think she says, when did we stop believing in the life within motionless things? So that idea of the sculpture as in one way a static form, the ultimate monumental kind of form, but in another way a dynamic form. And it's also really again, we're warned off metaphors, but that point in the narrative where John is reflecting on the Critias boy, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, that's right.
And there's this whole thing about, is he moving forward? Is he turning towards, or is he turning away? You know,
a statue displayed outside the Parthenon in Greece, am I right?
Yeah, and it's reputed to be the earliest, isn't it? I think incorrectly to be one of the earliest and they've representations of the body.
They've only fragments left of the statue, and they've arranged it on a frame that sticks it together.
But the fact, I think, that idea of turning towards or turning away from that dynamic movement, I think is really, really informs in some way the shape of the book as a whole. You know, the question is John involved in turning towards Bernadette, turning towards a life of art, a life of making, or is he avoiding something else by doing so? You know, I think that's one thing that really stood out for me in the book.
And you feel we're sort of left there at the end, Dar, with this character who's continuing to deflect or evade.
Yes. And there is a realization, obviously, of the importance of human love ultimately at the center of his life, you know, rather than, I say, this transcendent, this sense of seeking meaning elsewhere. I think it's you're seeking meaning where you are.
Yes.
So if there is a conclusion, I suppose that is what it is. It reminded me, you asked me before if it reminded me of any other works. The other story I was trying to think of, you might remember it, was there was a Pádraig O'Connor's story about a sculptor. You remember that?
I don't, I'm afraid.
Right. That was about this trying to sculpt something, this kind of struggle to sculpt something. I remember reading it in school, I think. But it sort of resonated with that in some way, that struggle of form, you know, and in some ways that the book represents a struggle of form, an attempt to move language into a particular shape, to maneuver it into a shape that is meaningful. And I think he does that.
Thank you, Lucy.
Irish Books is hosted by Christopher Murray and produced by Martin Franklin for East Coast Studio, with support from the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Embassy of Ireland Australia, and Monash University.